This is the Ask a Photographer podcast, answering your photography-related questions about general photography, workflow, editing, business, and marketing. To submit a question, go to beblino.com/ask. Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. My name is Mike, and I'm from beblino.com. Today's podcast is about photo editing. And the question comes from Lilly, and Lily's saying, I love taking photos every day, but I'm frustrated when it comes to my post-processing. I'm a member of a few Photoshop and Lightroom Facebook groups. The skills of some of the people are just amazing. There are times that I wish I could just remove distracting objects from my photos. Do you have any tips on how I could get better at editing my photos? Hey Lily, thanks for your question. This is one of those questions that it's there's no right or wrong. Should we be processing our photos to the nth degree that it doesn't look like a photo? Should we be removing objects from our photos? There's no right or wrong. What you want to do is completely up to you. Now, having said that though, there's probably a few things that we should do before we edit our photos. Getting it right in camera, as much as we can, will help reduce the editing of our photos later. Now, I'm not talking about head swaps and things like that at this point. There's a time and place for that. You know, if we can get at least 90% of our photos completed in camera, so our composition, our lighting, that type of thing, if that's all worked out, and we could reduce a whole heap of time and a whole heap of worry as well from ourselves. You mentioned here that you wish you could remove distracting objects, and that's fine. You don't mention as to what the objects are, but it could be people, it could be lampposts, it could be all sorts of stuff. Thing is, before you actually photograph, you should be composing your photo in such a way where you don't have these distracting objects in the photo, right? I know that there are times you just can't avoid that, and removing, if you're at, say, a landmark and you want to remove all the people, then that's different, right? And you're more than welcome to go and remove and clone everyone out. It's one of those things that if you can pre-visualize your photo and get as much done in your camera, you'll save a lot of time on the back end, which is the editing part. Knowing basic editing techniques such as how to light and darken a photo, how to add sharpening, how to do contrasts and work the highlights. So these are basic tools that everybody should know how to manipulate. And before we start removing heads and objects, we should know that. Working with a file format such as RAW will help editing our photos later on, because with the RAW file format, there's just the information from the camera. It's not post-processed like a JPEG. So with the RAW file format, when you bring that into your editing software of choice, the photo is going to become quite flat, because when we take a RAW photo, it actually shows us the JPEG version on the back of the camera, and everything looks nice and punchy and the nice colors. What I do like about the RAW format is the latitude in exposure and some of the settings. So for instance, if I'm a little bit off with my exposure because things happen, right? If I'm photographing a bride and I'm photographing one way and then I turn around because stuff going on, I may have not changed my exposure, or I may have changed it a little bit too late and taken a few photos beforehand. Well, then the RAW file format has that latitude where I can bring the exposure back and make it corrected. Also, the other thing is that when you've got a JPEG file format, pretty much what happens as you take the photo, these are baked into the file. So the color balance, the exposure, any of the other presets that you may have in your camera, it's all baked into the file. And it can be done later in post and make changes to that, but it's a little bit more difficult, and the results are not always optimum. So that's just something to think about. Next would be if you're using Photoshop, is to actually use layers. So for every single tool that you use, change a layer and make those changes. And then, if you make a mistake, that's right, get rid of the layer. Not a problem. Whereas if you just use the history panel, there's only so much you can go back. If you're using Lightroom, using virtual copies, I like to use quite a fair bit myself, and I've got different versions of the same file. One could be a preset that I've applied, another one could be just black and white, another one could be just a slightly different edit, but then I'll also have, of course, the nice clean edit that I created that the exposure and everything is perfect on. So it's just another way of getting creative and just practicing. Next would be using presets as a starting point. So in full disclosure, I have presets that I sell in my store. I have presets that allow you to change exposures and contrasts and highlights and so on and so forth. But then I've got other presets that allow you to, they're very similar to a one-click preset. So you click it and your photo will come as close as possible to what the preset's meant to do. Now, when I say close as possible, there is no such thing as a one-click preset, so to speak. Reason being is that the reference photo or the photo that they created the preset on is a certain exposure and contrast and highlights and so on and so forth. If your photo is not close to that, your end result is not going to be the same as the preset. For instance, if your photo is underexposed by 2 stops, but of course the starting point of the reference photo was bang on correct exposure, well then your photo is going to be still underexposed. So that's why I say with presets, especially the one-click presets, use them as a starting point. You should always do that, and then you can either create your own or go on from there and just tweak them to be for your style. The next thing would be to go to websites such as Phlearn, Phlearn.com, and I'll put the link in the show notes, and also CreativeLive.com or even YouTube.com. All three, Phlearn is free. I believe he also has some paid products. CreativeLive is free to watch, but if you want to buy the download, you can. And also YouTube, we all know YouTube, it's free. You've just got to practice. And you watching these videos is one thing, but to actually mimic what they're doing is another, and you really, really should practice as much as you can. So what I tend to do is have some photos that I put aside, and I use these as my reference photos or photos I like to just work on. And what this does is it teaches me a few things. I mentioned earlier that I like to pre-visualize my photos, and when I pre-visualize the photos and I take a photo and it's not quite right, then I go edit it. Next time I go out, take a photo in a similar location or a similar type of environment, I'll know, okay, you know what? The composure here, the exposure here was slightly off, and to make a better quality photo, I just need to maybe work the scene a little bit better, meaning that maybe the angle of where the light was to the subject needs to be changed, or I just need to maybe use external lighting or something else. Okay, so what I'm doing here is learning from my photos, and that's how I treat editing. There's nothing wrong, Lily, to go and remove distracting objects. You shouldn't use that as an excuse to go and go, right, I've taken a photo, don't worry, I'll get it done later. Because that's wrong. You're not really learning, because, digital files, it's all cheap. You've already got the memory card, you can take stacks. It doesn't matter. Take multiple photos of the same thing, recompose. Try to get as much done in camera, and that way you'll learn a lot more. If you just practice every day, Lily, you'll definitely get there. And don't worry about the other people that you see that can change backgrounds and remove objects or even swapping heads. You'll get there. Don't worry about that. Thanks for your question, Lily. I hope that helps you. If you have a question that you'd like featured on the show, go to biblino.com/ask to submit your question. I'd love to hear what you think of the show by going to iTunes or Stitcher and giving me a review and a rating. And don't forget to subscribe so you get notifications of new episodes. Thanks for listening. Until next time, get out and take more photos. Oh look, it's a cat in front of a sunset.